invite Darío, or should I invite you? Right. Awesome, I'm so happy about this. This is finally happening. Hi, guys. So many names I know. Hey, hello.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm good. I should be in bed, but I was.
Why? Why?
I was watching this. It's new to me. It's a series. It's on Netflix. It's The Last Kingdom.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm watching series. I like the series, and this is season 2, the one I'm watching. So I'm usually, in bed.
Very late for you, right?
It's 11. Yeah, 11 p.m. Yep.
It's gonna be until midnight. Wow.
Yes. So let me get rid of this there.
Okay. Do you go to bed this late, or do you go to bed like very early? Is that a difference?
No, usually I go to bed at, I fall asleep around 11-ish, 12 sometimes, but I think that my schedule has changed a bit since the lockdown started, because usually I would work, say, kind of non-stop between 9 and 5, but because I work from home now, I have a siesta, so I take a nap. Can't help it. So that's something I'm going to miss when we go back to normal.
Normal. If we can ever go back to normal, right? Can we go back to normal after this?
People are talking about, earlier today we had this meeting with friends, and, like some people talk about that things will change, that we will appreciate this and that. And call me cynical, but I don't think we will change.
So you agree with Emilio? He said that 2 days ago.
So I don't think there will be, at least in the kind of foreseeable future, any major changes. On the contrary, I think that if there are changes, they might be for the worse. Like, for example, now we have demonstrated how easy it is to adapt to certain things, how dispensable we are, how disposable we are as well. And for example, how I can work from home and pay for everything that usually the university does. But now I pay for the internet, I pay for the electricity, I pay for everything, and they get the service anyways.
Yeah, well, that's not a very good thing to hear, I say, especially in our country.
No.
Okay, I have a question for you. I have a lot of questions.
Well, thank you. In the first place, thank you. Hello, everyone. And
a lot of everyone.
I've got my friend Fernanda from Esquel, Fernanda Reynoso. Well, we are friends, and she used to be the head of the Instituto de Formación Docente 809 in Esquel.
Hey.
Yeah, sorry. So you were saying, sorry.
Okay. Question number 1. I have so many questions. My students at CEDES have been digging deeper into your resume, and they came up with very interesting questions. First question is, we would like to know a little bit of your story, how you ended up in Scotland, and especially there's you coming back to Argentina, and then they want to know why you decided to come back, whenever it was that you came back.
So I finished my teacher education program in CEDES in 2000, December 2000. So I decided to move and live in Esquel. While I was in Esquel, I studied the licenciatura at Universidad Nacional del Litoral, always like from Esquel. And in 2008, I got this scholarship to undertake MA studies at the University of Warwick. That's England. That's like the Midlands. So I stayed there for a year, and one of my supervisors asked me whether I would be interested in going for a PhD program. And I said, yeah, I mean, that would be lovely, but I can't afford it. My parents are not politicians or drug dealers. And therefore, I said, well, I just can't. So she was happy enough to help me apply for a scholarship. So at the end of 2009, I went back to Skell, worked for 1 more year, then got the scholarship and came to the UK for 3 years. But I would be traveling back and forth between Warwick and Skell because that's where I carried out my fieldwork. Then during that period, I lived in Portugal for 4 or 5 months. And because I couldn't stand the UK weather, so well, here I am now, but anyways. So I decided when I finished the PhD, I decided to go back to Argentina, basically because I wanted. I wanted to go back. I found myself that I could make an impact back home. There were possibilities, so I had this. I was fortunate enough, and well, if Fernanda Reynoso is there, I was fortunate enough to get the opportunity of starting a new teacher education program in Esquel. Then I worked for the Ministry of Education as a curriculum designer, so I designed a curriculum for primary, secondary education and teacher education with a group of colleagues. And the conditions were ideal because I could do things. And people would be extremely open to changes, starting things anew. And that's one of the beauties of not having, say, long traditions on your shoulders. Because you just do things. Sometimes they work well, sometimes they don't. And so what happened was, I was really happy in a skill, but then professionally speaking, perhaps I wanted a new challenge. And I started applying for jobs in the UK, and this is how Strathclyde ended up offering me a post as a lecturer in TESOL, and here I am. So that was September last year. So I've been here only for, 7 months now? So, yeah.
Great. Well, that's a great thing for us. I always tell my students that says whenever we start reading your texts, I have to choose something to read because we don't have time to read everything. And I always tell them, it could be you guys. He studied here, so come on, you can get this far, and that's something I like. Speaking of texts, you have written a lot of papers, like, oh my God, a lot of papers. You appear on Google Scholar, like, cited hundreds of times. And I would like to ask you why you write papers, and why do you think teachers should understand everything that is behind writing a paper?
Now I write papers because it's part of my job. Now the university pays me to write papers. But that's the thing, and this is why sometimes I'm so critical about even people at universities in Argentina saying, oh, we don't have the time. My first papers, I wrote them in Argentina, in Esquel. And what I like about, now that's changing. What I like about writing a paper is that it stays with people, so you can go back to it. Perhaps, now that's different because you've got recordings, so you've got videos and you can go back to a talk. But say you go to a conference, you go and make a presentation, but the moment the presentation is over, then your thoughts also kind of evaporate. So there's no record of that. Whereas if I write it, first of all, writing is a test because you've got to put your ideas in writing in such a way that they've got to be clear enough for anyone to understand you, and you're not there to unpack something or say, no, actually I meant this, or actually I meant that, or let me rephrase what I've just said. What is there? It's more tangible. And what I like about it is that, to me, every time I write a paper is like a professional development program, a professional development course, because if I want to write something, I've got to read, of course, I've got to look at conventions, I've got to play the game of writing for publication. And it's also the fact of being open to criticism. These papers are reviewed by international peers. You don't know who they are, they don't know who you are. And more often than not, they get rejected. So like for every paper I get accepted, probably I get 5 rejected.
Been there.
But that's how you learn. I remember once a colleague of mine, when I founded, that's thanks to FAPI, when I founded the Argentinian Journal of Applied Linguistics, a colleague of mine said, well, I'm going to send you something, but I don't want to make changes. And I said, well, I'm telling you what, don't send it. Don't bother, because probably you will be asked to make changes. And that's the way I learn, because it's people who don't know you, so they will be critical, but they're always critical in a good way. So rather than saying this is not clear, they will say, maybe you want to make this clear by doing this or that. So they give you feedback. And for example, maybe when I get a rejection or major corrections, perhaps you get, or I get, 5 or 6 pages of feedback. Not even at university we give that amount of feedback. We just say, yes, not clear enough. We just throw something in the margin. We make a few mistakes, but whereas here it's like, so then you realize that these people really invested time and energy reading your paper.
That's true.
So to me, yeah, I like it. I enjoy it.
Papers are a kind of result of research. Do you think teachers should do some research? Is it necessary? Can we just teach and that's it?
It's, well, that's a tricky question, I would say, because we expect a lot from teachers.
Mm-hmm.
But let's be honest, they are not paid for doing research.
Mm-hmm.
It's not part of their job. Even when we do the teacher education programs, like the one at CEDES or anywhere else in the country, we are trained or we are educated to be teachers, because that's the main goal. The system wants us to become teachers.
Mm-hmm. And
the funny thing is that we should ask that question to probably my colleagues will hate me, but I've got the authority to say it now. People based at universities in Argentina don't really publish that much, at least not in international reputable outlets. So there's a lot of, for example, conference reports, like selected papers and conference proceedings, but there's not much engagement with the international literature, international publications. Of course, there are reasons for that. And one could be, every time we write, like for example, every time I write for an international journal, say Applied Linguistics, I am following the standards of the global north, of hegemonic practices, whereas in the global south, which is again a term I don't quite like, we've got different ways of writing, of course, different ways of engaging with writing processes. But coming to your question about teachers doing research and writing about it, if we want them to do so, then they might need the training for that, they might need the support. And this is something at least that, for example, Chubut has. All teacher education programs in Chubut have investigación educativa in year 3, and at least in the initial English language teacher education program in year 4, they have one subject, which is investigación en la enseñanza del inglés. So they have the support, initial support for doing that, but primarily for themselves. So this is, I like that notion of teacher research, that is research carried out by teachers, for teachers. And basically when I do research, I do it to improve my own teaching. Like, for example, I'm like a big fan of action research, but I just do it to improve my own teaching. And if those findings might resonate with other people, well, fine with that. Yeah, that's what I enjoy. But sometimes we sound like, or we might, and that's something, you know, a mistake I make myself, that once I like something, then we kind of go and preach, yeah, let's do teacher research, and people should be doing more research. But I can say it now because I've got the means, I've got the time, I've got the support, I've got wonderful colleagues that I work with, and it's part of like professional development. But I think it's meaningful as long as you want to do it. You know, the typical thing, when you're forced to do something, you know, I wouldn't like that.
No, it doesn't work a lot. Okay.
As long as it's meaningful for teachers, and there are different ways of, you know, different ways in which they engage in research, that's fantastic. You know, that in Argentina, we've got, for example, the research SIG that APIBA has, and they have created this wonderful community of practice where they support each other. And it's like peer to peer. They don't have like experts, whatever that is. And they are interested in helping teachers reflect on their own teaching and improve themselves through this sort of, what would you say, self-initiated way of professional developing.
Right. We need to keep working on that. Question number something. People interested in evaluation, assessment, and especially now online. Do you have anything to share with us?
About assessment.
Online.
One thing, huh?
Online, especially.
Online, but I don't have anything to say. Sorry, about assessments online, because it's something that has never happened to me. So I'm not in a position to tell people anything about assessment or testing online. The only thing that I'd say, because then I try to do that, to walk my own talk, is, you know, that assessment, you know, typical thing, well, it's very easy to say, but that assessment should be part of the teaching and learning processes. Mm-hmm. And then that should, like the assessment practices or the testing strategies, should reflect what we have been doing in class. Like typical thing. Sometimes we encourage students 24/7 to work in groups. So everything is group work, everything is collaboratively done, and all of a sudden the test is individual. Mm-hmm. So we've got to play around with that. So it's got to be, you know, basically something that runs across whatever we do in teaching, like coherent. Mm-hmm. So if we do A and B, then probably the exam, the test, or whatever it is that we use for assessment, informal, formal, continuous, you name it, it's got to be part of that process and show that coherence. It's like, these apps that train you to do something. So you are prepared for that by doing what you will be asked to do later, not something different, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with you, especially when we teach communicatively and then the tests are gap filling and putting the verbs in the right form.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or the other way around, yes, like you do everything like gap filling, and all of a sudden you want your students to write a letter.
Terrible.
That's something that happens to all of us, and it's a matter of being alert and reflective and questioning our practices. Yeah.
Definitely. You wrote somewhere that we need to go from demotivation to motivation, and that CLIL might help. Can you give us some ideas, like practical ideas, for using CLIL in a classroom that is not necessarily a bilingual school?
Well, my experience comes from doing CLIL in state schools, not necessarily bilingual or private schools. So I worked for a while in a bilingual school in a scale teaching literature and then critical thinking. That got me started with the idea of integrating content and language. But then all the CLIL stuff that I did was in secondary state schools in a scale. And practical things, for example, that was something that we, a group of colleagues worked on for a while. Typical thing, present simple, right? So rather than talking about grammar, we would talk about functions. So the focus would be on the functions of language. So we said...
Thank you for saying this. This means a lot to me.
So the topic is descriptions. Fantastic. So probably we tend to use, for describing something, for describing a situation, for describing a place, we use present simple, plus of course other things. And so rather than the typical routine, a day in the life of who knows what,
the breakfast and the brushing the teeth.
So we say, okay, so what if we do geography and we describe geographical features in Patagonia? We describe town, we describe something that's got to do with content. We describe, even for example, with students whose level of English is like entry level, something very easy, capital cities and countries, where you use present simple all the time for talking about geographical locations, the seasons, the differences between seasons, like the northern hemisphere, the southern hemisphere. So that would be something practical and easy. And now, like further down the road, when we started working with comprehensive sexual education, again, we started, for example, if the function was expressing opinions, so then that would be the function, and then we would decide, okay, so what structures do we want them to learn to express opinions?
Yes.
Because something simple as yes, no, I might be giving my opinion, or rather, I think, or to my mind, they should, blah, blah, blah. So we worked on that, and it was about, for example, describing the law, the comprehensive sexuality education law in the country, or it was about giving students situations for them to decide whether that was something to be critical about, to reflect on, to deconstruct, for example, stereotypes, or to talk about situations that were happening in the city. Like bullying because of gender diversity. So then we would be writing out on examples. We would be writing our own texts. We would be producing all the materials, mostly ourselves. Of course, it's like terribly demanding, but once you start working on it, then you enjoy it because it's probably less stressful than finding something that then you adapt. And there are wonderful examples. I remember these student teachers in Tierra del Fuego, in what you call it, Instituto de Formación Docente Paulo Freire, Eugenio is there, and they made these amazing lesson plans where they had the lessons focused on, for example, consent, focused on different dimensions of taking care of yourself, identity and whatnot. And that was, again, for teenagers in state education.
Perfect. I wanted you to say that, but it's hard for me sometimes to tell students that we can do this, even if your students are entry level, even if it's a public school, even if it's you have no books, no nothing. It's a little bit of dogma, isn't it?
Well, it is. I guess that, to some extent, in some cases, if you don't have any material, say a course book, then that could be a blessing sometimes, and because then you've got to start from scratch. Of course, this is terribly demanding, and it's a lot of work, particularly when we think about the conditions in which teachers work in the country. It's very nice for me to say here, I only teach literally 8 classes per term, and that's it. But at least if you do it with one class, and then again, if you work with your colleagues, so you have this small community of practice, so we two work together, and I make one task, you make another one, but at the end of the day, I'm going to have 2. Yes. So, if we share and if we are more generous about the tasks and things we plan, for example, I'm sure you're part of this terrific group, what is it called? Profesores de Inglés de la República Argentina, and teachers there are now sharing for example, for this emergency online teaching situation, they are sharing their videos, flashcards, games, things that they have developed for their own classes, for their own groups, but now they are sharing them with other colleagues. And that's beautiful. And of course, some things are fine, some things are not, but they are doing something.
Something real, because they are doing, it's not from textbooks or ideal places, it's like very real. That's something I like.
It is. It's extremely real, and it's like culturally responsive. So it aims to respond to your own interests and needs, but also to what the learners have in mind, to match what they want to do with the language, and how to make them become more critical, like critical citizens. This notion of intercultural understanding and global citizenship. But that's got to be developed and supported through, say, the L1, L2, L whatever. But it's a matter of wanting to do things.
Right. Speaking of dogma, a lot of people have reacted to the idea of dogma. Can you give us some idea? Do you have experiences, easy, beginner level, to share?
With dogma, yes. Trying to remember when we did. That was out of necessity, as the saying goes. Necessity is the mother of invention. When I, for some time, I worked at this night school in Esquel, and that was funny because all the students at the time were older than me, and and I was supposed to teach them English. And of course, the time the course books in the market did not, thank goodness, did not match that context, that profile, that learner profile. So we started working with their lives, their stories. And we would be talking about their own, for example, routines, their own plans, their own like narratives, their own anecdotes. So they became sources of input. And what happened was that, just, again, they became materials developers. And that this reminds me of something that we did 2 years ago, I think, last year in Chubut. We asked students in the province to write poems, comics, short stories with whatever language they knew. Some people maybe wrote a description of, say, a local football player, maybe 4 or 5 lines. And we put them together in an ebook. And that ebook then became a source of, like, a learning resource for teachers across the province. But you see, it was based on, or like drawing on, the learners as informants. So it was like course book free, the lesson, and it was like truly based on the learners' lives, trajectories as people outside the classroom, and also the teacher saying, hey, you know, I can do this. I can teach without a photocopy. I can teach without a course book. I can use what I've got here in the classroom. And even if it's an under-resourced place, then I guess that gives you more room for imagination, for being creative. So that's just wonderful. And then and this is when you have, I would say, like true empowerment and agency, because then you do things, you make them with them. It's trial and error, of course. Sometimes things work well and sometimes they don't. But you just do it. And yeah.
Experiences, definitely. It's necessary.
It is.
Okay, I got more questions. I have so many questions. Yeah, this is good. I'm glad I have the questions. What can you tell us about integrated sexual education at schools in English, if possible? How could we relate it to English?
Well, in Argentina, I would say, compared to other contexts, we are in a privileged position because we've got a law. So it's not whether I like it or not, or whether it's not an option. It is mandatory. So that gives us a framework to work on comprehensive sexual education. And now there are, at the grassroots, there are teachers in the ELT field producing content, producing experiences and materials, and raising awareness. And what happens is that it's not just a matter of working with learners, but I would say primarily, or as a first step, working with teachers. So, because the moment you start talking about comprehensive sexuality education with your learners, and but you've got to be comfortable with your own, as a teacher, views, beliefs, stories, sexuality and gender and diversity and how you perceive yourself. Because if you want to engage in constructive conversation with your learners, you cannot say, you know, if you ask them something and if they ask you back, you cannot say, oh no, I'm the teacher here, not here to talk about my private life. Well, they're not there to talk about their private lives either. it's a matter of constructing a community of trust and talking about things that people feel comfortable with, and there's a lot of work. So I would say that together with initiatives with learners, it's got to do again with professional development, because it is true that what's happening now is that if there's like no formal training or no formal support for comprehensive sexuality education in English. I attended a couple of seminars and then something online through Info about comprehensive sexuality education in Spanish. But of course, then we want to make the link with teaching and with the language the learners have, and with, of course, the purpose and aim as the Southern Cross of what we do. But it's a matter of exploring what teachers want to do with their learners and what they are comfortable with. I remember once, and I think I see them there. I remember once, a couple of years ago, we had these wonderful colleagues, Paola Coso and Gabriela Bruna, I always get used. They were extremely kind enough and generous enough to share their experiences with comprehensive sexuality education in Esquel. So they went to Esquel and delivered a seminar. But before that, probably I never told them this. Before that, some of my colleagues were a bit like, up in arms or scandalized, because they had, and this is interesting, they had this idea that they would be talking about abortion in favor of the legalization of abortion, blah, blah, blah. But they were just wonderful, because mainly the workshop was about gender diversity, different families and different family structuring. So like single moms, or whatever it was, and then gender representations or stereotypes in course books. So that way was so attractive, and that was so strategic that left people off guard, because they didn't go for, say, something, what's the word that's funny? They were not radical, so they were strategic, and it was about raising awareness, because usually when people, or when we are against something, or when we have our caveats about something, it's because it's out of our own fears. So it's out of our own feeling uncomfortable with something. So we put kind of the blame or the issue on someone else. But it's my own weaknesses that are coming up through something. And so that was wonderful. And for example, I still teach in this online program in Argentina. And last year, I teach this materia didáctica para secundario, and it's called a gender perspective across. And we started building up on this gender perspective through the different topics like grammar, listening, blah, 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 functions, CLIL, until they started working on lesson plans. So one of these student teachers wrote this beautiful, fully fledged lesson plan, and they could choose the topic, they could choose the target students, sky was the limit. But then they had to write a very brief, reflective piece where they would tell me what drove them to design the lesson plan the way it was. And one student teacher developed a fantastic lesson plan about abuse, domestic abuse. And it was for elementary school learners. So the language was accessible, the content, and that was really smart. Sometimes we tend to equate that because learners have like limited language, they are dumb, they're stupid. So like the language is easy, the thinking is easy. Well, not necessarily. So she, in the lesson plan, she really mastered this like going from lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. So she supported them in that process. And when I read the reflective piece, I just froze because she had been the victim of domestic abuse. And the assignment had been a chance for her to come to grips with her own experience. So it was like a way of facing her own demons and wanting her students to be aware of, to be empowered, to be alert about what may happen to other people or what might be happening in their own homes. Sometimes teachers might say, well, I don't want to get into those issues because it's like opening a can of worms. Well, but that's exactly the aim and the purpose of creating these spaces where people can talk about, where students can talk about what's going on in their homes, what's going on in their own lives. Because otherwise we're always talking about the queen, like royalty. Who cares? Well, I don't care. Yeah. I don't know if I answered your question.
I don't know, but it sounds perfect. Yes, I think it's way more than I expected. Definitely, I loved it.
I get carried away.
You were speaking about higher order thinking, and my students found this connection between CLIL, problem solving, and higher order thinking. And what advice can you give us to do that again in beginner level, public schools with no resources and no everything? Some experiences, maybe.
That was a group of 13-year-olds, no, 14-year-olds in a scale again. They were learning, again, describing that was the function through typical comparatives and superlatives, right? So we gave the students pictures, photographs. And at the time they had a team of researchers had discovered, well, they found like dinosaurs' bones somewhere in Patagonia. And some of the pictures were interesting because you would see, so you would have this gigantic bone there, and scientists like lying right next to the bone. So the first question would be, for lower order thinking skills, typical thing, who is like, or what's larger or smaller, scientist or the bone or whatever, blah, 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 for description, for recognition. But then the question was, why do you think this man is doing that? What is the purpose of that photograph? So this is when they start making hypotheses. Until they started thinking about why is that he is there? Well, that to show the relative size of the bone. So that gives you an idea of the bone and the animal in scale. So the scale of the animal through that. So we asked them to go through magazines, newspapers, or anything that we could, get hold of in the school, to look at pictures and to analyze things that we take for granted or that we just ignore, or that we kind of naturalize in pictures or advertisements or whatever it is. And we started talking about visual argumentation. And this is again with 14-year-olds. But we would guide them through questions and through tasks to look, to examine what they were looking at. And that was only through the use of pictures. So like in terms of materials, it was like, anything, because we are like a visual society, and therefore it's very easy to find material that could be challenged, that could help students become critical about things. Like typical thing, if Griselda Beacon is around, maps.
Mm-hmm.
Maps, like working with maps is just a beautiful way, again, of raising awareness. The way we have been instructed and the way reality is represented on maps and different maps and whatnot. And that's just beautiful. And we just take that for granted. We don't question ourselves in terms of how we are represented on a map. We just say, yeah, okay, so we are, down there, like typical thing, oh, we are so far away from, like the distance between A and B is the same distance between B and A. So, but those are things that we don't question sometimes.
These experiences you're sharing, did you speak, or somebody, the person in charge, did they speak language 1 or language 2 in that experience?
It was the teaching of English, but usually when we do CLIL in Chubut, we accept Spanish as well. That's another resource. Otherwise, that's funny that we keep on talking about intercultural education and bilingual education, but we treat the EFL classroom as a monolingual classroom, where to be able to speak another language, say Spanish, seems to be a curse or a deficiency. Of course, there are reasons for like the English-only approach, because sometimes that's the only time that the students will listen to quality input or will be surrounded by English. But we've got to, think about Spanish, and this is something that the NAPs have, to think about Spanish or other languages that students use as another resource. Like the typical thing, when they ask you to, students asks a question about, what's the meaning of this word? And you give the definition in English. Now the students got two problems, the words and your definition. So usually I just say things in Spanish, that's it. Unless, we work with synonyms or like, with paralinguistic features with your body or something. But I remember as a student, I would get the wrong end of the stick sometimes. I would get, can't remember now as a learner, but I would get the wrong answer, because I would think, and probably that would have been solved with the words in Spanish, and that's it.
Or look it up in the dictionary.
Yeah, no, that's not helpful. Well, it is helpful, but not 100%.
Not now. Okay. My students are worried about teaching online efficiently and exams online and psychological situations of students and teachers going through this moment. And this will be a question for you just as a regular person. You don't need to speak from papers, experiences. Just what do you think about this?
About, come again? Didn't quite.
Effectively assessing online and considering psychological states at the moment.
I'm not sure about the notion of teaching effectively. because that's so subjective and so impossible to attain. I would say something that works for me.
Okay.
So like good practice, something that's meaningful and relevant to me, to my learners, my context, the aims I have. So for teaching meaningfully, perhaps, well, that sounds like a redundancy, teaching meaningfully. During this times that we're going through, sometimes less is more, I would say. For example, I see that with my nephews and nieces. They get pages and pages of homework and activities to do that, sad to say, that I do for them for English. Because I asked them, well, do you want the version where I help you or the version where I do it for you? They would go for option B. And that's sad because, you know, and this is what happens. The moment I tell the answers to my nephew, I'm sure he will share them with everyone else. So it's like, you know, pretending to be teaching, pretending to be learning. So maybe it's just a matter of doing a lot less, or giving the students the answers, giving students ways in which they could do something that's, again, meaningful and not, you know, like cramming them with homework that then comes back to you, the boomerang effect. And sometimes we give them so many things to do, and they, of course, they expect proper feedback. And like sometimes when I speak to my niece, she's like upset or disappointed because maybe she put so much effort in something and then all she got was like, okay, good, sí, recibido. And so I would say less is more in this case.
Okay,
not
Darío.
Right publication, more is more.
Now it's less is more, you're right. Okay, we are reaching the end of the hour. I would like to thank you a lot for your time. You've been so kind to accept. I know it's late for you, and to, well, on all the previous discussion we had on WhatsApp too. Thank you so much for that. And let us know when you come back to visit.
Oh, hopefully that will be, because I was meant to go at the end of next month for a couple of weeks, but because of the pandemic, we just can't, of course. So I might be going for Christmas and New Year. At least I'm going to spend like time in Gualeguaychú and Buenos Aires, and then back here. But that's going to, I'm really looking forward to that, because that's going to give me a break from the winter, the dreadful winter here in Glasgow, which is, if you survive that, I guess you could survive anything.
Imagine that. Okay. So thanks a lot, and let's meet when you come back.
Okay, sure, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Deal. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope I made sense, because, you know, I'm not thinking. I just say things, and it's based on experience.
I took lots of notes. I'm super satisfied with this. And, well, there are lots of comments we couldn't deal with because there are so many, but I think we kind of talked about everything. Okay?
Say so. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, I'm happy.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks chatting to you. And thank you, everyone, for being there. Thank you. Okay, let's follow it up.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.